So, Matt, a super dark day yesterday for
we're recording this on Thursday, so this was the Wednesday disclosure of the second part, which is really the most important part of the official inquiry into Grenfell.
But scathing doesn't do it justice. I mean, it was beyond scathing.
It really was. Should we get a blast of Sir Martin Moore-Bick having his say?
The simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. They include the government, the tenant management organisation, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, those who manufactured and supplied the materials used in the refurbishment, those who certified their suitability for use on high-rise buildings, the architect, the principal contractor, and some of its subcontractors, in particularly Harley Curtain Wall and its successor Harley Facades, some of the consultants, in particular the fire engineer Exover Warrington Fire, the local authority's building control department, and the London Fire Brigade.
I mean, it couldn't be more damning, could it?
I mean, it's not only
everyone.
Is it damning in the headlines, but the more you read, I mean, it's a 1,700-page report, so I won't pretend I've read it all, but I've read, I mean, to the point of depression, I've read enough of it and enough of the detail to just think, my God, this is up there with the very, very worst elements of British history.
Well, as a sort of state of the nation document, you're right, it is deeply depressing because no one comes out of it well, apart from the extraordinary people who survived the tragedy. And I'm just, in case anyone has forgotten, I'm sure they haven't, but this refers to the early hours of June the 14th, 2017, 7 years ago. 72 people, including 18 children and 15 disabled people, perished in the blaze at the Grenfell Tower in West London. So that's...
Matt, because I'm sure, I mean, I hadn't taken the trouble. I'll be absolutely honest. I hadn't taken the trouble. I'd read reports with scant detail and sort of pen portraits of the victims of this. But I hadn't really taken the trouble to really go through them one by one to really try and understand their stories until I remembered that this report was coming up a few weeks ago. And there are a number of places where you can find this, but the best one I found was The Guardian's. I think they put it up originally in 2018.
Right.
But they told the human stories of all the 72. And I will put the link in the show notes, but I honestly commend people because to go and look at it and read these stories, because I guarantee, unless you've done that, you'll have an impression in your head that is something we should talk about, which is cultivated by media and by all sorts of unsavory agendas, that this was a house full, a tower block full of itinerants, of immigrants, of people. Not at all. These were stand-up British citizens. They were stand-up people who come here to make their lives here.
Just ordinary people
with ordinary lives, but in almost unfailingly, extraordinary human stories about how they ended up there.
Many.
It's worth taking the time to do that.
And we'll put the notes in the link in the show notes. That on Newsnight last night, Wednesday, there was a few people from Grenfell United, which is one of the main representative groups of the survivors. And there was a guy called, I think his name was Diego, on Newsnight last night, who was very young when the blaze happened, and he's a student now.
Yeah.
And he was saying how, his whole life really has been defined as an adult growing up by the blaze, its aftermath, and both the paradox of being part of a community of survivors, but also the oddity of that. And it's a story we've encountered in other contexts where people's, that long periods of their lives are defined by the aftermath of what happened.
We'll come on to it in more detail probably later, but today there's a lot of people saying, we We want justice. This is one of the key strands. There's so much to talk about. The trouble we're going to have in the next half an hour is filtering out what's really important. But one of the things that's really important is the extended period of time this is all taking, and people referring to Hillsborough. And the fact that, and them saying we're not going to be treated like the Hillsborough families were. Hillsborough families waited 30 years and still nothing's happened.
Well,
one conviction for health and safety.
By geographical coincidence, this story really has its origins in Merseyside. Yeah. Because the first sort of warning was in 1991
in Highton,
in the Knowsley Heights block, right? And cladding was found to have had a role, and nothing happened. And then there was a test failure on the cladding used at Grenfell in 2001. That was shelved. And then there was the Locarno house fire in Camberwell in 2009, 6 killed, and nothing really happened. Now, it's clear. I mean, we can talk about the companies as much as you want, but it's clear that at the heart of this there was political failure, and no governing party comes out with clean hands. However, I don't know what your impression is, but mine is that the worst period was the coalition government period.
Well, there was a phrase, and I read it this morning.
Bonfire of better red tape.
And my God, I thought, that phrase, it's David Cameron's bonfire of red tape. Yeah. And there it was like a Roman candle off the A40.
It's a very important sort of, it's a foundation to all the horror that followed this, because I remember that period, and Eric Pickles was the community secretary for most of this period. He's now in the Lords, and he was in charge of a lot of the deregulation involved. And he claimed at the inquiry, quite angrily, I think, that fire safety regulations were exempt from the rolling back of red tape, the cutting of red tape. And the report is very stern about this and says that claim is, quotes, flatly contradicted by that of his officials and the contemporaneous documents. In other words, there was cutting of regulations.
Yeah, and even the regulations, Matt, that were I remember we did a front page in the aftermath of it, and it was quite controversial at the time, because we had the image of the tower as the letter I in the word austerity.
Right.
And one of the points we were making was that this is both a combination of the slashing of red tape, but also
cutbacks,
yes. And the
in Whitehall as well as
in Whitehall, but in the local borough, you have a woman leading the housing committee who deliberately pauses, slows down, delays the insistence of the installation of working fire doors in this tower because of budgetary issues. Now, there are about 100 examples of this, and it's impossible. Isn't it lovely when you come across a crime with a single villain?
Yeah.
But this is much worse.
This is a murder on the Orient Express.
It really is, but without mitigation. At least they had a sort of reason.
Yes.
This is just greed and negligence. And when the families call for manslaughter charges, and you look at the definition of manslaughter, of involuntary manslaughter through gross negligence, it is very simple to me. And it begs the question, why is the bloody Metropolitan Police still, okay, so they can say, well, we had to wait for the report and we've got and I know they've got 180 officers.
I don't know.
They've had a huge team working on this for a long time. So they've not been sitting on their hands.
No.
But there seems to be an attitude amongst the establishment that we will respect this process to the nth degree.
But I don't see why there has to be a sequence of official inquiry and then...
No. In fact, quite often it's the reverse.
Exactly. And indeed, we know, from recent experiences, I know it's not the same, but... Starmer ran the courts hot during the riots, and rightly so.
Right,
when you want the wheels of justice to turn, you can make them turn.
Absolutely. So here's that, mate. That is a brilliant point. Imagine if Keir Starmer had said, "We're going to have an inquiry into these riots, and then once that inquiry is finished, then the police will then pick up and look for prosecution."
People would crazy.
There'd be riots about the riots.
Riots about the riots. Exactly.
I
think that. I mean, I want to kind of intrude one big thought, which is one of my favourite books on how states work is by an American writer called George Will, and it's called Statecraft is Soulcraft. And his point is the way you run a state, the way you organise a state, says a lot about your soul as a nation, as a country, as a community, as a neighbourhood. You know, the looking at things just in terms of technical efficiency is not enough. You know, and he's not talking about God at all. It's not a religious point. He's talking about morality and decency. And what you have here is a real reproach to our idea in this country of what constitutes the public realm, because there's absolutely no doubt that what was happening here in all sorts of contexts was the veneration of business and its profit motive and stroke the desire to rein in public spending was considered more important than the well-being and safety of citizens.
Correct. And this is where
that's a huge point.
And this is where that's exactly the truth behind when people say, "Oh, the system's broken," and they say it about Hillsborough, and they say it about Grenfell, they say it about Windrush, they say it about the blood scandal. The system's broken. The system's not broken at all. This is how the system was set up to be.
Exactly.
The system is set up to delay, protect, prevaricate. And the reason it was set up to do that was because the people who set up the system were the people who are at risk of being caught out by these kind of things.
And, you know, we've been told for 40 years that business is better than government at running things, right? We've been told for 40 years that what's been variously called compulsory competitive tendering or procurement policy or whatever you want to call it, i.e. you contract out, is better. We've been told that, you know, most government, or not most, but an enormous amount of government spending is waste.
Yeah.
And this is the result. Here we are. This is the result, is that in the end, people die.
Yeah.
And as you said, we've had a series of, and they've been quite accidentally rat-a-tat in the last few months. So we had the absurdity, I mean, wonderful that it happened, but of an ITV drama about the sub-postmasters, Mr. Bates versus the postmaster versus post office on ITV, leading in less than 10 days to snap legislation.
Yeah.
Then we had the blood contamination scandal, and that you know, when I was listening to the report yesterday on the TV, I was reminded of the guy who did the blood contamination report. It was Sir Brian Langstaff, and he gave a similar, actually even more impassioned speech at Methodist Central Hall in Westminster, saying, you know, we just can't do this. We can't have a situation where 3,000 people have died and there's all this delay and all this kind of incompetence. And, you know, the what worries me, and it's a sort of theme we keep going back to, is that the proposed redress is, as you said, slow, because the prosecutions are going to take, I mean, they're talking about laying charges at the end of 26, which means 27, which means that they won't go to court until 28, 29.
Because they say the cops have got to go through, the Met said, we've got to go through this huge document line by line. But they've had all the material. They've had 180 coppers on this for years now.
It shouldn't, I mean, to be honest, although it should be, say it's irrelevant, but the inquiry should be running in parallel with the efforts of the police to recommend charges to the CPS.
There should be people on remand by now.
100%.
You know, there should. I mean, I'm not trying to mitigate the actions of these rioters, but when you got 14-year-old kids and teenagers on remand for throwing bricks at coppers, right? And the state can crack down with that alacrity. 7 years after 72 people die in this thing, and absolutely no question of the culpability of a whole list of people, from the architect to these Studio E people to the people in the council who nodded through these Studio E design company purely because they'd designed the school and the leisure centre. And they wanted it to look the same.
Right.
Because let's not forget why this fucking cladding was on this building in the first place. It's because it's in the middle of the richest borough in the country, and they wanted it to look nicer.
Yep.
Because, you know, I Googled on Rightmove today. Do you know how much a 2-bedroom mews house looking up at the Grenfell Tower now got? 3 million quid. 2-bedroom mews house.
Right.
And it looks up at Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
So, of course, they want things to look nice.
They didn't want an eyesore.
And they appoint a company that has got zero experience of tower blocks, of cladding tower blocks, of working with occupied buildings. No experience at all on record now, with those people saying, we don't know what we're doing here. We're a bit green, was the phrase. Right, that was the euphemism. And they were nodded through without any public tender or anything, because they deliberately kept it below the threshold of cost.
There were various points at which the regulatory bodies were essentially operating self-regulation.
Totally.
And what that meant was exactly what happened in the 2009 crash, the financial crash, which was that, yes, there were ratings agencies, but they had to solicit business from the company. So if they didn't give AAA ratings to the bonds, they'd go from Moody's to S&P.
That's how the system works.
So that's how the system works. So in fact, what looks like a regulatory structure wasn't. Yeah. And again, you can't say it often enough, people die. Now, Starmer said in the House that this was a moment to reflect. I'm not sure that's right. I mean, I think it's a lot more than that.
We've had 7 years
to reflect. There's been plenty of reflection. And I'm glad he apologised. I'm glad Rishi Sunak apologised. But frankly, you know, warm words and all that. Yeah. What we need now is action. And I have to say, I was gobsmacked to learn that he said we're going to write to all the companies involved saying you're not going to get any more government contracts.
Ooh.
But hang on.
Half of them are out of business anyway.
Well, but what you mean they've been getting
250 million
worth of contracts
since
these companies that were prima facie, at least guilty. I mean, you know, at the very least, their access to government money should have been suspended the day after the blaze. Have carried on. And he said, I'm going to write stern letters to them all saying, if you think you're going to get any more money, unbelievable. And I noticed on the Today programme Thursday morning, Angela Rayner was sent on, and she couldn't give a timetable.
No,
not even a kind of ballpark timetable for action.
Because here's the other clue about how much people really give a shit about this, right? Really care. Is that there's 4,630 other tower blocks clad in this stuff, right? And 29% of them have had it fixed. 7 years later. That's how much they really care.
So we come back to a place that we often come back to, actually, which is, in the end, I think this is all about power. And there are the powerless and the powerful. And, you know, your point about why the cladding had to be put up because it needed to, merge aesthetically with the neighbourhood. That's the powerful. And the companies involved in all this were and they had revolving door access to Whitehall and Westminster. They were the powerful. The people in the tower block, and to your point, tower blocks like it, they are the powerless. Now, I'm actually at the point now where I'm really alarmed and worried and frightened, because I do not know whether progressive parties have cottoned on to how strong the sense of that divide is.
You can dilute it to degrees, but you can trace almost all of the big problems we've faced recently. You can stem back to that emotion of having no power. And there are two responses to powerlessness. One is that you are given a sense of a stake and a fair shake, and that you are being looked after by the state, and not coddled, but looked after, and you can expect a minimum level of decency and safety for yourself and your family. And you can walk in the streets and live in a decent place without burning to death. That seems to me a fairly minimal thing to expect. Or if that does not provide, you start to look around for other alternatives. And this is why we live in an age of populism and nationalism all over the world, because there are large chunks of quite wealthy societies all over the world where a large number of people just don't feel they have any stake at all. There's so many paradoxes in this story and I'll be honest again, I've really struggle to be coherent in my thoughts, and maybe
it's difficult.
Maybe the
enormity of it.
Maybe the listeners will help us. But
I hope so.
One of the paradoxes that strikes me as needing somebody with a greater level of insight than I can bring to bear on it, but to pick through, is the fact that this happened in London, in the richest borough in the country,
yes,
in a very visible area. It's right. People who don't know it, it's right by a flyover, and the countless stories of people driving past, and it's like 100 meters away.
Yes.
It's huge. And if you're driving out of London towards Oxford or Coventry or Birmingham on the M40, you're heading towards the M40, you'll still to this day drive past this tower, now clad in memorial green, Grenfell forever in our hearts. And every time we drive past it, I wonder to myself, I'm not quite sure what the answer is, why it's still there, why it hasn't been demolished.
It's a very interesting question.
Why something hasn't been done to, I don't know, memorialize it properly, or anyway, whatever that's a different conversation. But so you get this extraordinary visibility. One of the things people say about London is the great thing about London is that you're cheek by jowl. Everything's, all the social classes are mixed, and wherever you are in London, it's not like Paris where you get this central ghetto of magnificent wealth, and then all the banlieue suburbs. Everything's mixed together in London. But what strikes me as interesting about Grenfell is that was both the cause, and because people, it was there, it was seen to be an ugly building, needed tarting up, needed to be done up, and it's also the reason that we are so staggeringly enraged by it is that it was so visible to the whole world. If that had happened in a suburb somewhere, it would have been a huge story in the UK, but it wouldn't have been the global story it was. The reason it was such a global story was that it happened in the heart of one of the world's great cities.
You're right, but yesterday, Wednesday, by a rather unsettling coincidence, there was a tower block fire about 5 roads away from where I live. Right now, I live in a Victorian house. And I've walked past that block literally thousands of times in my life. And I've never thought, I wonder if they're safe. Right? I've never thought about it. And thank God no one was hurt. It was fine. It was okay. But it was uncanny, the sort of contemporaneity of it. And I think that what you say is right. But, we do live cheek by jowl. But there is a massive tendency that comes with power and wealth and status of all sorts and privilege to lock out certain sites. Right?
And the othering of people.
The othering of people. And a great discourse has arisen in the last 20 or 30 years, which has blamed certain categories of people for living in the most dire circumstances in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. The attacks that are made on people who are begging or homeless, or people who are living in very reduced circumstances, or people who are, as we now know, living in incredibly unsafe circumstances, or so much people who are migrants or seeking asylum. They are othered in a huge way. And it's interesting that in a book that is prophetic in all sorts of ways, Bonfire of the Vanities, the lead character, Sherman McCoy, refers all the time in a different use of different word to insulation. That what he is seeking all the time, because he lives in New York with his family, and obviously there's poverty and crime everywhere, is insulation. So he'll pay for a limousine to take him from his penthouse to the social function a few hundred yards down the road, in order not to have any contact. Now that's a sort of satirized version of something that I think is very real. And unless we kind of start to think of people as citizens rather than simply consumers and the beneficiaries of what they, it basically make do. You make do with what you're allowed when all the money has run out and this is what you have to make do with. And yeah, it's unsafe, but what do you expect?
Well, that was one of the things. Do you remember there was a really, really great journalist, although I think she hated the New European. I think she thought we were a bunch of arseholes. Dawn Foster.
Oh, yes. Much missed. I mean,
who died aged 34.
So young, so young.
But, prickly, acerbic, all of these things. But she was straight in on this story.
Yes.
And she uncovered a blog that was very crucial to the narrative of the story, where the residents of Grenfell had warned specifically, there's going to be, if there was a big fire here, it would be a very big problem because, there are all of these problems. She uncovered that. She wrote a piece for the New York Times. She died, sadly, about 3 or 4 years ago.
That's right.
Very young, 34, I think. So Dawn Foster said at the end of this piece, the level of public anger right now since the Grenfell disaster is forcing people here in the UK to confront the issues of class and race, gentrification and public policy that it is now clear can be deadly. And I think she's nailed the problem there.
Yes.
But since she wrote that, nothing has happened.
Nothing has changed.
I'm not sure that we have confronted those issues
I don't think
at
we've
all.
even begun to concentrate upon them.
It's when you see, you remember the other, if Dawn Foster's at one end of the spectrum of empathy and caring, you go to the other end of that spectrum and you find Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Oh, yes. God, yes. Who
in 2019 said to Nick Ferrari, Nick, if you and I were in that fire, we would have ignored the fire brigade and we would have left because we'd have used our common sense.
So
now,
there
you have
the deserving dead.
It is the absolutely they didn't have enough common sense to save their own skins.
Yes,
mentality. That is
this is
heart of it.
We're straying a little bit away from Grenfell, but let me give me a bit of rope here because I have one of my pet theories is that when a society is not dealing with an issue, it sort of bubbles up in culture. And the lead item in this week's New European culture newsletter is another one of these Eat the Rich are Terrible series. Very good, called The Perfect Couple, starring Nicole Kidman, right? 2 weeks ago, it was Blink Twice, which was another The Rich are Terrible thriller film made by Zoe Kravitz, right? We've had The White Lotus. Yeah. We've had, was it The Triangle of Sadness?
Sadness.
Right.
Yeah.
On and on it goes. And I think that... there's too many of these to dismiss it. Yeah, there's a taste for this, and there's always been a taste for the pornography of the rich, right? Yeah. Going back to Brideshead Revisited and before, and Bridgerton and so on. But I don't think it's just that. I think there is a genuine anger now at privilege, wealth, status, and the powerless that comes with it. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this.
No, but I think you're right.
People are really, really angry. Yeah. And let's say, Starmer is obviously good for a while. And let's say Kamala Harris is elected in America. And, we hope that there'll be a decent progressive government in France when they can get their act together. But these are the questions they have to address. And they're not incremental questions. Yeah. That's your point. For the thing you quoted from Dawn is that they might have been incremental questions 20 years ago, but now they are big. The dashboard is flashing red. Time. Yeah. And every time one of these reports comes out, there are 2 or 3 days of something must be done. Yeah. And then we resume business as usual, don't we?
Well, I mean, look, just go back to everyone we've mentioned in, the post office scandal, Hillsborough, blood, Windrush. Ultimately, we go back to business as usual, and it just becomes a part of a fiction that we're on some narrative arc of progress. Yeah, we're not at all. And it'll happen again in 2 or 3 years. There'll be another thing will happen, and we'll all stand there and say, "How did that happen? That's terrible," because we're not addressing the fundamental reality, which is that what David Cameron and Nick Clegg allowed to happen with their bonfire of the red tape, this sense of allowing the market to run rampant, is contradicts, or it's literally playing with fire, because human nature is about greed and getting ahead and about
Doing what you want.
That's just opening the door to the worst of our natures. Where there was a brilliant, I think he was the president of REBA, or he was the Royal Institute of British Architects, and he was talking about how it was when he was a young architect, and he had an Act of Parliament on his desk, right? He said, because the Act of Parliament, within the Act of Parliament, told you how you could build a fucking staircase.
Right.
It was prescriptive. It told you everything you need. These are the regulations, and this is why. And that's what was taken up and thrown into the dustbin by this bonfire of red tape. This sense of, bugger that, just let people do what they want.
I mean, we've grown up with it, haven't it? I mean, the very phrase red tape implies that regulation is bad.
Yeah.
But what is regulation? Regulation is, generally speaking, not always, some regulations are bad, but generally speaking, it is a rule that has been put in place to prevent the repetition of something bad that has happened in the past. That's a working definition of a regulation.
No one argues about regulations when they're driving at 70 mile an hour on a motorway.
Yeah, and
the cars are all going in the right direction.
Yeah, and also the banks don't object to the regulations that to their benefit. They object to the regulations that aren't.
That's right.
And I think that one of the big political cultural changes we're going to have to get out of is the idea that that business and the financial sector have to give permission to politicians for them to be elected. So on my way here, I was reading something about the Harris campaign, and they were bigging up the fact that Goldman Sachs says that if Trump wins, the economy will take a downturn, right? Yeah. And bigging up the fact that she'd made this big speech about small businesses. And that's fine. And that she was business friendly. And that's fine. But the tone of the coverage was, you see, she's brilliant. You know, in other words, she's doing what business want.
Yeah.
She's doing what the banks want.
She's let them off the leash. Yeah.
Or whatever. Just as that's the criteria.
Yeah.
You know, not she's... And I'm not impugning Harris specifically. Yeah. This is a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
But you know, the idea that actually, and this is why I have such a bee in my bonnet about bloody Davos, is that the people you have to persuade in order to get into power and stay there are the people that own everything.
Yeah. And with that, and you and I both know, and count amongst our friends people who are infected with this sense of arrogance and we know best, and this is where you end up, I'm afraid.
I mean, one of the lowest ebbs I had with my feelings about Keir Starmer was when he went to Davos the first time, I think, and he was asked whether he'd prefer to be in Westminster, which is our representative assembly, by the way, Mr. Prime Minister, or Davos. And he said, Davos, it's, you can talk to people and really... And I thought, I thought that is really bad news.
Oh, do you know who I mean, we should move on before it turns into just a general sort of pub rant. But Lula in Brazil, President Lula today said about Elon Musk, just because he's rich doesn't mean we have to put up with his free-for-all far-right nonsense.
Hallelujah.
Right? I mean, there you have leadership, folks, in a sentence.
That's it.
Just because he's rich doesn't mean he has to trample over, he has the right to trample over the rights of the people who voted me into power. No. Listen, politicians, listen.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to... Peter Thiel, the great tech titan of Silicon Valley, at least had the honesty to say liberty and democracy are no longer compatible, which when you unpack it means what I want as a tech titan is no longer compatible with the kind of stuff that democracy produces. Yeah. Well, there's a choice.